New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
Hello, everybody. Reverend Mark Gilbert here, and welcome to our Saturday morning conversations around the Science of Mind textbook by Ernest Holmes. I'm glad that you're joining us today. It's Saturday morning here in Colorado, and like Tracy Brown often does on these programs, I'll show you I've got my cup of coffee here to keep me fired up and going along, although the words of Ernest Holmes are often enough to keep me fired up, just to be honest. It's great to be with you this morning. And if you're watching us live, I want to encourage you that if you want to make any comments or answer any of the questions I'm going to throw out over the next few minutes, to be sure and throw those comments into where the media stream that you're watching, be it Facebook or YouTube. Your comments that you put on the page will not only be there for other people to see, but they will flow to me. And Fiona, good morning from Geneva. We're welcome and glad to have you here with us today and participating. So if my consciousness allows me to talk and read at the same time this morning, I'll be looking for those comments so that I can weave them in to the conversation and we can direct the flow in the manner that you want to go. This week we are looking at the chapter, The Power of Thought. The Power of Thought. And if you've got your textbook, it's on page 137. But the first thing I want to do is you have your Science of Mind book out, and I've got my copy that I write all up in, and it's coming apart, but this is the one that I often have a dialogue with notes all through it. But this is the copy that I'm going to be using this morning. And what I'd like to do is to acknowledge that chapter 8, which starts on 137, is the first chapter in what is part 2 of the book. And so before we dive into the content a little bit, what I'd like to do is to reference where we are in the flow of the book. And I'm looking back at the table of contents for just a moment. And in the table of contents, and if you've been following along in these programs for the last few weeks, you know that we started by looking at the 4-part introduction. And that's actually gives an overview of the entire philosophy of Science of Mind, that everything in the book is built on that 4-part introduction. And so the first 4 weeks of this particular video series, we covered those. And then we got into the main aspect of the book. And the rest of the book, all of the parts in it, part 1, 2, 3, and so forth, they're all building on the information that was outlined in the introduction. So the intro gives you an overview of the philosophy. The rest of it then builds on it. And for the last number of weeks, what we've been going through is part 1, the nature of being. Holmes in this aspect is starting with the big questions of why are we here? What is God? What is the universe? What is spirit, soul, and body? He's laying out at the high level of the philosophy. And then after we have the underpinnings of the philosophy that's been put forth in part 1 of the book, he then gets into part 2, which we start with today. And part 2 is called Spiritual Mind Healing. But if you look at the table of contents, you'll notice that part 3 is called Spiritual Mind Healing. And one of the questions that you might have is, why didn't he just combine the 2 sections? Why do we have to have 2 parts that deal with spiritual mind healing? Well, you'll notice that if you're looking at the table of contents or at the first page of either of the sections, that the part 2 that we're starting today has a subheading of the word ideation. Ideation. Now, ideation means a number of things, but it specifically means in this context the creative process. The creative process. That is the thought cycle. The thought cycle where thoughts and ideas move from the idea of a thought into manifestation. So what he's saying by using the subheading ideation is that we're now getting into a part of the book where we're going to be talking about the creative process, the creative flow. Whereas if you look at part 3, it's the word under that is practice. So if we sit back and look at this from sort of a high level, what we'll notice is that part 1 of the book was the overall big picture cosmic questions, that we all want to have answers to, why are we here, etc. And then now he's moving into something that is more of a practical application for that philosophy. But in the first part of the practical application, we're still moving into theory. So part 2 of the book, and where we're going today, is theory regarding the creative process. And part 3 is the actual stressing of the processes used in that. So part 2 is actually a bridge. Cosmic high level, part 1. Part 2 is how we are looking at the creative flow from a theory standpoint, but we're moving towards practical application in part 3. And just to complete the rest, you'll notice part 4 of the table of contents later on, and where we're going later this year, is called the perfect whole. That's where he brings it back into the mystical nature of oneness and what the mystics taught and that sort of thing. So where we're going today is part 2, and the chapter is entitled The Power of Thought. But looking at the rest of part 2, the power of thought is followed by prayer, then faith, and then mental and spiritual treatments. There's a logic to that flow. And the logic is that each of where we're headed in the science of mind is ultimately towards the idea of mental and spiritual treatment, which is the basic practical application of the philosophy of science of mind. That's where we're headed. But to get there, Holmes felt that we needed to take it through some logical steps. The first one is to understand the power of thought. And that's the topic for today. Because he felt like the power of, if you understand the creative flow and the creative sense of of how thoughts are creative, you have to accept that and know that at the essence of your understanding in order to move to the space where you can effectively use the spiritual mind treatments. So this is like a prerequisite. So now in a minute, I'm going to be, I want to go through what I see are the essential points that he makes in this chapter in the power of thought. We're going to go through it in some degree of order. I don't know where my stream of consciousness will exactly take us over the next few minutes, but I am going to outline what I see are the essential points as the beginning. But I want to throw a question out to those of you who are watching this live. And if you're watching this on a recording later, you can add your comments to the field. I obviously won't see them right now, but think about this question. Do you believe that your thoughts are creative? Do you really believe that your thoughts are creative? And what is your answer to that question? And why? Your answer can be yes or no. Do you believe thoughts are creative? If so, yes. Why? Why do you believe they're creative? And if you don't believe they're creative, why not? Now, I suspect that most of you are watching a Saturday morning series on the Science Mind textbook. You probably already believe to a degree that your thoughts are creative. But there could be people out there watching this off the internet where you believe that they don't. And the situation is, as humans, we all have evidence to support both answers. We've all had experiences where our thoughts showed some creative actions, and we've all had experiences where we thought and that didn't seem to happen. So we can all point to evidence that supports both answers. Well, here's what I'm asking you, and if you're watching this live, what I would encourage you to do is to put that out there, to actually indicate that whether you believe thoughts are creative or not. Fiona says absolutely, yet she sees the resulting effect. And I would agree with that, Fiona. There's plenty of times that I've seen the resulting effect. Quick story is, one of the first times that I ever have thought back over my life, and when have I seen thought creative? There's been big things in my life that I really wanted, a job I wanted, a relationship I wanted, etc. And I really, really, really focused my thoughts and energy towards manifesting that in my life. And one of the first examples of that was when I was a young child. I think I was in first or second grade, and at that point, I didn't have a real a firm a spiritual understanding of life. In fact, it was a mixture of magic and mythical things going with the traditional religions of the day. And where I was growing up, it was, Christian religion. And so I had this vision of God being the old man in the sky. So I had all this stuff flowing around. But the situation that was happening was that I was at school, and a new girl came into class. And I looked at her, and it was immediately, my heart's thumping. It's like, wow, I wish I was sitting next to her in class. And so I went home that night, and I pulled out all the stops. First, I used my magical, mythical aspect of it. Is I'd heard that four-leaf clovers had magical aspects to them. So I was out in the yard going through clover and finding four-leaf clover, and I picked those four-leaf clover. And then I had my Bible. My Bible had to have some magical power, so I was putting four-leaf clovers into my Bible. And then I thought that God was an old man in the sky, so I lay down on the grass and I looked up at the sky and at the clouds and imagined that old man up there, and said he was listening to me. And here I am holding my Bible with my four-leaf clovers in them, and said, please, please, please let me be moved next to that young girl. Please let me sit next to her. She is so cute, and I want to meet her and get to know her. And the only way that's going to happen is if I'm sitting next to her in class. And so I just sat there and prayed and thought, and but in retrospect, I did everything I could in my consciousness to shift to an awareness that I could sit next to this young girl in class. And lo and behold, the very next day I go to class, and the teacher shifts us around, and I am next to this girl. And one of the things I realized from all of that is the power of thought. And the other thing is that I wasn't complete in my picture, because I should have also prayed for the gumption and strength to actually talk to her. So I sat there across from her for the rest of the year with a degree of shyness that kept me from actually getting to know her like I thought I would. But it's just a quick example. But the funny thing is that all throughout my life, I've got plenty of examples where something that was a conscious, direct focus of my attention allowed me to see and sense and create that manifestation in my life. And it's been evidence to me that there is power in thought. Yet there are times where I think and think and think and pray and pray and pray, and it doesn't happen. And what we often do in Science of Mind is say that or something greater. We add that on because we know there are greater aspects of life that are flowing to us, and sometimes we don't see the big picture. And we'll talk more on that as we go along. In this particular chapter, The Power of Thought, and again, if you are watching this, the question I'm throwing to you is, do you believe that thoughts have power? If so, why? And if not, why? But I was reviewing this chapter and thought there are essentially 5 key points, 5 things that Holmes is bringing up in this chapter. And let me just run through them real quickly in case I don't get to all the quotes and things in the chapter that I want to today. But there are 5 things that I think he's essentially making in this chapter. The first is to recognize that we humans have long known that thoughts have power. That's the very first thing, is that we've always known this at some level, that thoughts are creative. The second one is that he's pointing out that to use this power most effectively, we have to know that we're immersed in an intelligence that responds to our thoughts. The third point he's making in this chapter is describing how that infinite intelligence responds to our thoughts. And by the very nature that there is a similar nature between our awareness and consciousness to the consciousness that is contained in infinite intelligence. Because there is a similar nature in our consciousness, that the infinite consciousness of the divine responds to our thoughts, because those thoughts in our consciousness is a similar nature to what that nature is of the divine. That's the third point. And the fourth one, which is the actionable point in this chapter, is that he says that our goal is in controlling our thoughts. That the more that we can stop thinking unproductive thoughts and replace them with productive thoughts, the more that we're going to manifest the life that we desire. So humans have always known about thinking. There's a power, that infinite intelligence that responds to us. and our thoughts, that power responds because there's a like nature between us. And our goal is to control our thinking, to be more positive, have more positive thoughts. And the fifth point is sort of what I would label Holmes talking about thoughts. There's a lot of this chapter where he roams around and talks about a whole host of ways of looking at our thinking so that we'll recognize and see the power of thoughts and how to think about them. Here's just a few of them. He describes that our thoughts are a movement in a field of consciousness. He describes that thoughts vibrate and that they vibrate at different levels. He talks about how thoughts attract and form those things that are the like. He describes how thoughts repel thoughts that are unlike them. He talks about how thoughts are unconscious for the most part. He describes how thoughts are things. And he describes how thoughts create a mental atmosphere around us. So there's a lot of discussion in this chapter about looking at thoughts as a field, an energy, a vibratory aspect, an attractive and repelling force. And that's the way he's trying to encourage us to shift our thinking about thoughts, because we walk into life, and the way most of us have developed is to think that thoughts are something that are occurring in my conscious awareness right now. Whatever I'm thinking about is what my thoughts are. And I'm unaware of the atmosphere or their nature to repel or attract. All I'm thinking is that my awareness are my thoughts. And I can imagine that you have thoughts going on inside you, but I think that there's like a barrier between us. That's the natural way we look at this. We don't think that we're swimming around in a field of thoughts. And he's trying to reorient our thinking to see that we really, truly are swimming in an ocean of the divine. Okay, so that's where this chapter is going. And again, if you've got a question or comment, be sure to throw them either in YouTube or Facebook Live. And even if you're watching after the fact, put a comment up there and hopefully we'll see it and respond to it. But if you're watching it live, be sure, and I'm going to watch for those, hopefully, and respond if I see them. Now, as I said, the first thing that he wanted to talk about in this chapter is that humans have long known about this. We could go on in the whole program talking about the history of how humans have recognized the power of thinking. And he only does this for about a page and a half here, maybe just about a page. But he wants to set the stage to say this isn't anything new. Humans have long known about the fact that our thoughts have creative power. And he harkens it back to the Greeks and, Aristotle and others, in his very first paragraph. I would take it back even further. There's other writings of Holmes where he talks about the Hermetic teachings. The Hermetic teachings were actually teachings out of ancient Egypt for over 3,000, 4,000 years ago that were first written down by the Greeks in the late times of the Egyptian. But the spiritual concepts that came out of the Hermetic teachings 3,000 years ago, the very first one of them was that the universe is mental. And so this is something that's been long known at certain levels of our being. Now, aspects of humanity have gotten away from that, but there's always been this undercurrent that thoughts have a creative power, and they've always been with us. Now, the idea of new thought and all of this sort of blossomed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And one of the things that we have to remember is that Holmes' writings in this book was published in 1938. It was in a re-edit of the version from the 1920s. But at the bottom of page 137, he says, unless we discredit all human testimony, we're forced to the conclusion that bodily healing of all manner of sickness by mental and spiritual means. We're focused to the conclusion that there is a way in which all manner of sickness can be healed by mental and spiritual means. Is a fact. It's a fact. And he goes on to talk about mental healing. Now, one of the interesting things is that mental healing, let's put this in a historical context for a moment. I'm going on an aside. But in the 1800s, physical healing and doctors were not very well developed. The 1880s were when, they induced chemicals and metals into people's bodies to try to heal them. They used bloodletting and things of that nature. So the late 1800s and the early 1900s was when the there was a shift in our use of the physical uh, 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 healing methods of material medicine. And in the 1800s and such, material medicine wasn't that well developed, and so there was really a search for something that would allow us to expand upon the methods of healing that were not working well in the 1800s. And in the late 1800s, there was a real movement towards mental healing. The whole aspect of mesmer and hypnotism and things of that nature led to a whole development of mental healing. So when he talks about mental healing here, it's coming on the heels of a lot of growth and development in the mental healing. And I think what's happened is, however, the healing nature of allopathic medicine, modern medicine, Western medicine, has developed so much in the last number of years based on human thought and our evolution, that we now rely on it, and sometimes to the fact that we don't think about the power of the mental healing. But one of the things that we can always point to is that whenever a new drug comes about, they have to test it against placebos, and there's always that aspect that the physical nature of life is is controlled to a degree by the mental, and placebos have an effect that we can heal through that. Anyway, let's move on. So the very first chapter, the very first page or so, is simply on this topic of pointing out we've always known that healings. Then as we get into the next few pages and on 138 and 139, he begins with the very first principle. He highlights that the first principle is that we're surrounded by infinite intelligence, which reacts to our thoughts. It's right there on the bottom of 138 and towards the middle. First principle fundamental to the understanding of the operation of thought is that we are surrounded by infinite intelligence. We have to begin with that. So let's stop and think about that for a moment, because we tend to, like I described a moment ago, we tend to think of ourselves as these isolated pockets of consciousness walking around. But we have to shift and recognize that every day our consciousness is thoughts that are in a field of consciousness energy. There's this infinite flow through us. And so right off the bat, the science of mind is asking you to orient your attention to see not your thoughts as being something contained within the skull of your head, but to being an energy that's flowing and interconnecting with a field that flows through you continuously. And that's not something that we've naturally been taught most of our life, but it's an essential point that we need to anchor into our awareness as we launch into these teachings. He says on the bottom of 138 that an intelligence which is great enough to encompass the past, to understand the present, and to be father of the future. It is the cause of everything that has been, and that out of which must unfold everything that is to be. Our own intelligence is one of the activities and is of like nature to it. What he's getting into here is the fact that our intelligence is the same intelligence that's in the divine, in that infinite intelligence. We have what he calls is finite intelligence. Finite in us because our awareness can only see our intelligence as being so big. It has, in our awareness, limits to it. But its nature is the same nature as this flowing energy flowing through us. So what we want to do is to see and expand our awareness of our intelligence to be on a greater and a greater aspect of effect in this flow of the divine or infinite intelligence that is within us. So how does it actually react to us? We have a similar nature, and he gets into this on page 139, down in there in the section entitled "The Act of Incarnation." The last paragraph in that section. The infinite mind then imparts itself to the finite through the act of incarnation. The act of incarnation. The word incarnation means to take form. So what Holmes is saying here is that how our finite consciousness or finite awareness is responded to by the infinite in this flow through us, and they have the same nature, is that the infinite takes the finite consciousness and incarnates it. That is, it takes those into form. It brings it into form. There's a key point in the very last paragraph of 139 I want to stress. It says, to the extent that we learn to control these mental states, we shall automatically control our environment. That is why we're studying the power of thought as we approach the subject of spiritual mind healing. It gets to the point I was making a moment ago, is that Holmes sees that we have to absolutely see that we have a creative power in this thinking that we're doing in order to give energy to our spiritual mind treatment. In order for spiritual mind treatment, where we're ultimately going to be effective, we have to truly believe at the heart of our hearts and the soul of our being that thoughts are creative. Again, because we have evidence that supports both ways, so we need to be shifting. And of course, even if we believe thoughts aren't creative, we're going to get evidence that thoughts aren't creative. So what we need to do is to shift more of our thoughts to thinking than seeing the creative power of thinking. So the question to anybody watching again is, do you believe your thoughts are created? And if you do, why? And if not, why not? I'm curious as to what you think about that thing. However, let's jump ahead. And moving on, he gets into us. There's one thing on 140 I want to stress. If you're a student of Science of Mind, you're probably interested in hearing the words of Ernest Holmes. And there's a lot of audio recordings out there that you can hear. He did a radio show for many of years. Many of his talks were recorded. And if you go to the Science of Mind archives, you can download all kinds of audios and find them out on YouTube. And I've got links to a lot of them on my webpage, Conscious Bridge. But right there in the middle of the page, you'll see that he has the term, "It is done unto you as you believe." He is stressing the words of Jesus and the word "as," and that things are done unto us as we believe. So it's the "as we believe" part that he wants us to recognize, that the more that we believe in the power of thinking, that the more we will see that our thinking creates our manifestations around us. There is one video of Ernest Holmes that you can see. For a short period of time, he took his radio show onto TV. And back at that time, they didn't record all the TV programs. But there is one recording of one TV show that you can find out on YouTube or the internet or the Science of Mind Archive site. And the point that he makes in that one video is this point. He stresses this quote by Jesus, that it is done unto you as you believe. And I think it's highly, a little bit ironic that the only one video that we have of him speaking is stressing this particular one point, because it is one of the most important ones we can make, is that we have to truly believe in the power of our thoughts to create in order for all of the Science of Mind concepts to work for us. So that said, let's move on. He then gets into the thought force that he describes over on 141, that thought is a movement of consciousness. Now, in a field of mechanical but intelligent law, that can be a sort of overwhelming when you're first hearing that kind of statement. What the heck is he talking about? Thought force. Now, again, we're not having to force our thoughts. He stresses this elsewhere, is that we just have to think, and we don't have to force anything. But our thoughts in themselves have their own force. Because remember, what we're talking about is an infinite intelligence that's moving through us. It has the same nature in its intelligence as our intelligence. Our finite intelligence is being flowed through, and as we think, we're creating a movement in this flow. We're creating a movement in the field of consciousness, and specifically into the subjective consciousness, so that it allows itself to then move into that process of incarnation. And what is incarnation again? It is to bring into form. So what he's trying to get us to see is that by thinking in that flow, our thoughts incarnate into form. The thoughts are incarnating into form. And he describes this, and I want to read this last paragraph down there where it says, "Let us suppose," because he gives an example of how this process works. He says, "Let us suppose," and I'm on page 141, "for illustration, that the universe is nothing but water, permeated by the infinite intelligence. Imagine that every time this intelligence moves or thinks, ice is formed in the water, exactly corresponding to the thought. We might have countless pieces of ice of different form, color, and size, but these pieces of ice would still be water. If we could heat the entire mass, it would melt, and all the forms would again become fluid. nothing would have changed except form. The physical universe is spirit in form. What he wants us to really anchor into our awareness, and I know I'm being a bit repetitive here, but I want to stress it too, is that we have this finite intelligence that's anchored into and is acted upon by this infinite intelligence flow through us. And that as we think something, it forms those crystallizations within the fluidity of spirit and creates them into temporary forms which manifest into our lives. We can think back to, Einstein's famous equation that energy equals mass, squared, E equal mc2, where the constant squared. And but the point being that either side of that equation, energy and mass, consciousness and form, are on either sides of the equation. There's a continuous flow between them. And this whole universe of form is a temporary existence that then melts and floats back away into the consciousness of the divine. And we are constantly, through our individual thoughts and the collective consciousness of humanity, are creating these forms which are temporary. The goal then is to want to create our thoughts in a way that create the life that we want. And so that is essential to us. Okay. Moving on. Again, if you've got questions, be sure to post them. If you have thoughts on the power of thinking, be sure to post that up there. On 142, he talks about a thought atmosphere. I love this visualization. I've written some blogs on it on my website before because I've really thought about the fact that we do have, and if we can, one of the ways I like to look at this, if you've ever watched or seen the Peanuts cartoon, and they have the character Pigpen who walks around with a cloud around him, and a cloud of dust in his case. But I like to think of Pigpen because he's walking around with a cloud of thoughts, a thought atmosphere around him. And we actually all are like, I think, Pigpen in a way. We're all walking around with this thought cloud around us. Have you ever gotten around somebody who just immediately you liked them, loved them, they were positive, there was something about them that attracted you to them? And on the flip side, you've probably gotten to some people going, I don't really want to be around that person. What is that? What is it? What is that? And one of the things that I think it is the very nature that we build up these thought atmospheres through all the aspects of what we're thinking. And as we walk around, we have an atmosphere that we're creating. So the question I would ask you, what kind of atmosphere are you creating as you're walking around and interacting with people in your day-to-day affairs? Are you creating a positive atmosphere of thought that knows that, the world is in your life is expanding and growing and evolving to its highest potential levels? Or are you, woe is me and I'm a victim of this world of form? And whichever one you are, whichever thing you believe, you're creating an atmosphere about that is other people can be attracted to and repelled from. Holmes also talks in this chapter about the fact that our thoughts create a vibratory force. And many people in the teachings of the law of attraction say that the higher we can bring our vibrations up through the power of higher thoughts, greater thoughts, more expansive thoughts, more loving thoughts, more inclusive thoughts for ourselves and others, the more that we see oneness and divinity in the life, the more that we raise the vibration of our thoughts up. And then we attract into our life that very similar thing. So then the question is, can we create thoughts? Can we? Fiona, yes, how powerful to visualize a cloud of my thoughts around my head. It really is, because if we tend to forget that. It's one of those things that like I said, as much as we can study this philosophy, and all of us are in a process of our own personal evolution. All of us are, as much as I can study this and know this and have been reading Science of Mind since the 1980s and studying it, so deeply for the last 20 years, it's still easy to flip to that moment where, okay, my thoughts are only in my head. I forget that I'm creating my world. It's very easy. It's a process of it's like building up a muscle. We have to continue to remind ourselves and develop that muscle and practice. And any technique that we can use. And if visualizing a cloud of thoughts around us, that thought atmosphere, If we can imagine ourselves walking around like that, and we're impacting people there all the time, and that cloud is impacting us, that cloud of thoughts and all the thinking that we've thought previously is impacting us, the greater it's going to be. It's to serve as a reminder for us to build up that mental spiritual muscle that we are that our thoughts are creative. Elsewhere in this chapter, Holmes talks about the fact that most of our thinking is unconscious. Most of our thinking is unconscious. And what does he mean by that? Because, we tend to think that our consciousness is what we are aware of. But, we got to sit back and recognize there's lots within this physical form that I call Mark. There are many cells that all have their own consciousness that are maintaining homeostatic effects for my physical nature. That within me and my subconscious is a flow of thoughts that have built up over time about how I see life, that sit below the level of awareness, that drive how I believe and think. That there are patterns of thought that have existed within me for so many years that need to be replaced. I have habits that I've developed. Those habits drive thought patterns that are subconscious. I just immediately think X, Y, and Z because I've always thought X, Y, and Z to the point now I don't even think about them. They're below the level of awareness. And we all have these subconscious thoughts. And so much of our day-to-day choices of what we're doing, the very nature that I drink coffee most mornings is probably, it's a habit to a degree, but it's unconscious. It's just like, got to get my coffee. And all of us have these habits. And those habits, direct ourselves into, oh, I can do this, or oh, I can't do that. That I don't have the ability to do these things, but I do have the ability to do these things. And these things become so ingrained in us that we don't even see them. And so below the level of awareness, below our conscious level of thinking, is a whole body of thoughts. And they're in that atmosphere too. Our thought atmosphere that we're walking around with includes a lot of thoughts that we're not consciously aware of. They're thoughts that we have thought forever, except at the base level of who we are. And so the goal of Science of Mind, and as we move to more accepting of the power of thinking, is to start bringing those up into conscious awareness so that we can shift them, so we can start replacing the old patterns and the old thoughts with new thoughts. Okay. To that point, I'm over on page 143. There's a quote down there under choosing thought that I highly want to stress this one. He says, we cannot live a choiceless life. Every day, every moment, every second, there is choice. Every day, every moment, every second, there is choice. You're choosing to watch this video or not. You're choosing to drink coffee or not. You're choosing to let your mind think about something about what I'm saying or not. You're choosing to sit in a chair or stand. You're choosing to raise your hand or not. You're choosing to write a note or not. Every moment we're making choices, and the choices are not only actions that we're taking, but that every thought that's occurring. Every moment we're either allowing the old patterns to flow so that stream of infinite intelligence, as it flows through us, as it helps build and embody that thought force around us, it's either choosing those old patterns of unconscious thinking, and that the movement in consciousness, that the creation of taking that infinite intelligence through the finite intelligence and manifesting it in incarnation into form, to freezing those ice crystals of our thoughts, are either coming from subconscious thinking of old patterns, those are choices too, or they're coming from conscious thoughts, thoughts where we're claiming and thinking the highest of what we want. Every moment you're making a choice. That's a good mantra to remember, is that every moment, every second, there is choice. There is choice. How are you choosing to look at life? When people talk with you or you're responding to other humans, how are you choosing to? Are you responding from love or from indifference or from dislike? When you look at the world and where it's going, how do you look at the world? Yes, there's a lot of challenges going on currently in the physical world. How do you choose to see them? Do you choose to see them as humanity's going to hell in a handbasket kind of thing? Or are you choosing to see them that, okay, these are lessons that humanity needs to learn as we evolve to even higher states of who we're going to be? These lessons play out in our individual lives. They play out in the moments of big choices. We can all recognize the big choices that we have to make when we have a conscious choice about taking a job or a relationship should continue or not, or whether we're going to go one place to eat or another, or there's all kinds of choices that they're real aware of. But every moment is a choice. And the more that we can bring our awareness to the fact that how I'm living my life and how I'm responding to life, both in those things that seem small in our physical lives, in our individual lives, or things that are big in the big infinite world in which we live, that we are responding to all of these from day to day. And how are you responding? Are you responding from a lower vibratory level where you're responding with a sense of fear and doubt and misapprehension and concern and thinking that things are going to get worse? Or are you responding from a love and caring and oneness and desiring to see the greatest and greatest expansions for humanity? Every moment is a choice. So as we end this morning, and I hope this has been beneficial for you, I just want to stress the points that Holmes is making in this chapter again and bring them home for you. We've always known that thinking has power. Humanity has always recognized that at some level. You who are watching this have evidence in your own experience that thoughts are creative, and you've also got experience that they aren't. Why would they not be creative in a moment? Subconscious old patterns, inconsistent thinking. Sometimes there's a bigger world, and we forget that we think our mind, we forget that our mind is an infinite a finite expression in the infinite mind. But the infinite mind might have a bigger picture going on. And sometimes it's the collective consciousness of the world that might be making something happen. And so when we think that our thoughts aren't creative, it only recognizes or represents the fact that we don't know the cause in that moment. And we have to be open to that. But the more we can shift and see that our thinking is creative, the more we'll be using our finite thinking to manifest those thoughts and crystallizing them into the world of form and creating this life that we truly want to have. Not only as an individual being, but as a part of the big picture of all of humanity and all of life. So Holmes puts it in historical context, reminds us that we need to be anchored into the awareness that we live in an infinite intelligence that responds to our thinking, that it responds because its nature and our nature are the same, and its process causes our thoughts to take form, that our goal then is to create and control our thoughts by replacing old unprotective thoughts with productive thoughts that are moving us in the right direction. The more that each of us individually do that, the more that collectively we're shifting the consciousness of the planet as well. And finally, Holmes calls us to use these things that he cites as reminders for tips for how to shift us, to know that consciousness and our thinking is a movement in the field of consciousness, that our thoughts vibrate at different levels. How are your thoughts vibrating? That like attracts like, and that we can repel things that we desire by unproductive thoughts. That most of our thinking is unconsciousness, and we need to shift it into conscious awareness. That thoughts are actually things, and that thoughts create an atmosphere around us. The more we can picture those things, the more that we know that consciousness and our thinking creates the world that is around us. And the more that is anchored into our awareness, the more that we can be preparing ourselves to use the tools of science of mind, and specifically the spiritual mind treatment, where we're headed in this section, so that we can create the greatest and highest level of lives, not only for ourselves as individuals, for this planet, and for all the people and sentient beings on this planet that we care for. we each have a responsibility. We each have a responsibility. Blessings and love to everybody today who's watched this. I hope you've benefited from it. And I hope those of you who watch it on the video also received something from this that you find helpful and serves you on your spiritual path. Thank you.
Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Denver, for your continued support. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Midtown Atlanta, for your monthly contribution. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living North Jersey, for your monthly contribution. And please help us welcome Om Center for Spiritual Living in La Mesa, California. Thank you for your monthly donation. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Seattle, for your most generous donation. And a special thanks to Hefferlin Foundation for your generous technology grant. And Suze Ajit, thank you for your very generous donation. And a super special thank you to Dr. Tracy Brown, RSCP. Thanks for being a super donor. And a big shout out to all our committed donors.